Hey everyone! Tonight's episode takes us somewhere different. We're skipping the big ideas and diving straight into the messy, tasty world of medieval snacks. Think less philosophy, more fried dough and cheese. Even without modern fast food or vending machines, people back then still found ways to snack. Some treats were surprisingly good. Others? Let's just say they were interesting. But every one of them was unapologetically medieval. Before we get started, feel free to like and subscribe, only if you're actually into this kind of content. Drop a comment too, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing this little community span across different places and time zones. Now, settle in. Maybe lower the lights or turn on a fan for that cozy background hum. Tonight, we're easing into a time when snacks were fried in pig fat and nobody checked the expiration date on anything. Let's talk apple fritters. In a world where most medieval snacks looked suspicious and tasted worse, these were a rare gem. Sweet, hot, and just risky enough to be exciting, fritters were the closest thing they had to donuts. No frosting, definitely no food safety, but still a real treat. The apples? Not the perfect shiny ones you see in stores today. These were small, tart, and probably stolen from someone else's tree. Chopped up and mixed into a batter of flour, eggs, and often ale. Because water wasn't always safe, and ale made life a bit more bearable, they were then fried in animal fat. Usually pig fat. The same oil was used over and over, so it carried a lot of history. Let's call it flavor. Fresh from the pan, a fritter had crispy edges, a soft center, and a real chance of burning your fingers. If you had money, a sprinkle of imported sugar made you look fancy. If not, a bit of honey or spice syrup did the trick. Either way, it was enough to help you forget your cabbage-heavy diet for a while. Fritters weren't everyday food. They were for markets, fairs, and post-church cravings. You'd grab one with greasy hands, maybe share it, maybe not. Kids begged for them. Adults lined up. Even birds tried their luck. Sure, sometimes they were undercooked or the batter was too tough, but when everything came together just right, they were magic. One perfect bite, and suddenly medieval life didn't seem so bad. Now if fritters were the donut of the Middle Ages, cheese curds were their popcorn. Tiny, chewy, and kind of squeaky, these weren't trying to impress anyone. They didn't stretch, melt, or look good on a plate. But they hit the spot. Medieval cheese didn't aim for beauty. It needed to be made fast, eaten quickly, and survive travel, poor storage, and maybe even a goat stepping on it. Cheese curds were just the early stage of cheese, little fresh chunks that formed before it aged into something hard enough to survive a siege. To make them, farmers used rennet, which sounds fancy until you realize it came from a baby animal's stomach. The milk was separated into curds and whey, the curds were pressed and salted, and that was it. No fancy aging. Just soft, rubbery lumps of cheese. Sometimes they were smooth. Sometimes they squeaked between your teeth like they had something to say. But they were easy to carry, filling, and strangely satisfying. And in a time when most food was either pickled or pretending to be something else, that was more than enough. Cheese curds were the kind of snack that didn't need a reason. No feast, no holiday, no saint's day. Just a regular, rough-edged treat that fit into everyday life. You'd find them in a monk's lunch, a traveler's pouch, or being devoured by kids like it was candy, assuming the cows had behaved and the milk supply was good that week. Compared to the usual fare, like stale bread or leftover broth, curds were a little win. You could fry them, crumble them onto stews, or eat them straight from the bowl while trying not to notice you smelled like livestock. They weren't flashy or fancy, but that was part of their charm. Cheese curds were dependable, mildly chewy, the quiet kind of snack that never stole the spotlight but was always there when you needed it. Sure, they weren't always fresh. Freshness was a moving target in medieval times. But salt and enthusiasm did a lot of heavy lifting, and people weren't exactly picky when refrigeration didn't exist. So no, curds weren't a celebration food, but they were simple, filling, and just special enough to count when other options fell apart. Also useful for bribing both cats and toddlers. Bonus. Now, let's talk about turnips. Definitely not dessert. But medieval cooks, working with what they had, and driven by sheer desperation, looked at a turnip and thought, what if we made this into pie? And weirdly they did. Turnip pie wasn't always a disaster. Sometimes it bordered on decent. It started with mashed turnips, hopefully cooked until soft. A bit of egg bound things together. Maybe some honey or dried fruit, if the cook had extra supplies or was feeling generous. Then the whole thing got wrapped in a thick crust made of flour, water, and hope. Best case scenario, it came out warm and slightly sweet, kind of like a pudding had a fling with a root vegetable. Worst case? It tasted like livestock feed in a pie shell. But either way, it filled you up and pretended to be dessert. The secret behind turnip pie's popularity? Turnips were cheap, and pie crusts could hide a lot. Overripe, bitter, undercooked. It didn't matter much once it was baked and drizzled with something sugary. That alone gave it a spot at fairs, feast tables, and monastery kitchens where monks had too many root vegetables and not enough better ideas. Sometimes they threw in spices. Nutmeg if the monastery was rich, pepper if the cook liked chaos. Raisins made guest appearances now and then, usually to everyone's confusion. Nobles wouldn't go near it unless they were play-acting poverty or needed a political photo op. But for everyone else, it was dessert, or something close enough. And despite its questionable origins, the turnip pie stuck around. People liked it, or at least didn't hate it enough to let it die. It was filling, cheap, and had a little sweetness, pretty much the holy grail of medieval food. But if we're crowning a true champion of comfort food from that era, it has to be the meat pasty. Picture a thick-crusted, handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat and baked to golden perfection, or maybe just slightly burnt. It was the medieval hot pocket. No microwave, but plenty of flavor and a surprising level of danger. What made the pasty so great was how portable it was. You could eat it walking down the road, out in the fields, or even while watching a public execution, because life was weird like that. The crust was tough enough to keep dirt, rats, and peasant sneezes at bay, while still keeping the filling warm. Practical, hardy, and ready for anything. Living near a manor or hunting estate had its perks. Real meat like pork, mutton, or venison might actually make it into your pasty. But if you weren't that lucky, things got more creative. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. If it moved, it could be chopped up, seasoned, and baked into a crust with just enough herbs to keep you from asking too many questions. Spices like garlic, sage, and pepper were your best friends, not because they made things taste amazing, but because they masked the unfortunate reality that the meat had been resting longer than it should have. Still, when lunch usually meant bread and maybe an onion, biting into a warm, greasy pasty felt like luxury. There were vegetarian versions too, root vegetables, leeks, or cheese for religious fasting days or the pious. But let's be honest, meat-filled ones stole the show. You didn't need to know exactly what was inside. You just ate it and crossed your fingers that the cook wasn't having a bad day. Sometimes, especially among workers like miners, people marked their pasties with initials or symbols to claim their snack. In some places, the crust was made thicker along one side, not to eat, but to hold with filthy hands and then toss away. Whether it went to spirits or rats depended on who got there first. So, were they good? Often yes. Were they mysterious? Boys. But that was part of the fun. You didn't bite into a meat pasty for safety, you did it for flavor, warmth, and a little adventure. Now, shifting gears from meat to mint, let's talk about candied fennel seeds. They were tiny, sugary, and herbal, and about as close to a breath mint as you'd get back then. These crunchy little seeds were part treat, part digestive help, and part dental gamble. Making them wasn't easy. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, and beaten into submission. So if someone took the time to coat fennel seeds in it, you knew they were serious about their snacks. Nobles loved them. After a heavy meal, a small dish of these was passed around. Part palate cleanser, part cover-up for the lingering mutton breath. Fennel has a sharp, licorice-like kick. Some people loved it. Others just smiled and swallowed fast. The sugar helped balance it out, but that herbal bite always stuck around, making you feel a little elegant and a little confused at the same time. These seeds weren't just for taste. They were believed to help with digestion, especially after meals that involved too much meat and meat. Think of them as medieval chewing gum meets after dinner mint meets Tums. But harder. Much harder. You didn't just pop one in and chew. You tested it first. Bit down slowly. Listened. If it didn't crack your tooth, you were good to go. Risk and reward, medieval style. While nobles got the real thing, common folk sometimes had to settle for homemade versions. Honey, crushed herbs, and a little hope. It wasn't the same, but close enough to pretend. In the big world of medieval snacking, candied fennel seeds didn't fill your belly. But they freshened your breath, added a touch of class, and made you feel a little less like someone who hadn't bathed in a week. Now, if any dessert wore the crown in medieval times, it was the honey cake. Sticky, sweet, and beloved by almost everyone. But we'll get to that next. Let's rewind a bit. If you were lucky enough to live near a hunting estate or a manor, you might actually get your hands on decent meat, pork, mutton, maybe even venison. But for the rest of the population, medieval meat pies took a very different turn. The filling? It was flexible. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog, anything that moved or slithered could end up inside that crust, especially if you didn't ask too many questions. The pastry itself was just the wrapper. What mattered was the spice, garlic, sage, pepper, used not so much to enhance the flavor as to distract from it. Because let's be honest, that meat had probably seen better days. But compared to the usual lunch of dry bread and maybe a sad onion, a warm pasty stuffed with actual protein felt almost indulgent. Vegetarian pasties had their place too. Root vegetables, leeks, maybe some cheese showed up during fasting days or when meat was off the table for religious reasons. Still, the meat ones were the stars. You didn't need the full ingredient list. You just hoped the cook wasn't holding a grudge that day. Among laborers like miners, the pasty was a staple. People would carve their initials or symbols into the crust to avoid mix-ups. In some areas, one side of the crust was intentionally thickened, not for eating, but for holding with soot-stained hands. After the meal, that part was tossed. Some said it was for the spirits. Others knew it was really for the rats. They could be great. They could also be a total mystery. But that unpredictability was part of the charm. Eating a meat pasty wasn't about playing it safe. It was about eating something hot, hearty, and possibly questionable, and doing it anyway. Now, from mystery meat to medieval mints, let's talk candied fennel seeds. These tiny, sugar-coated seeds were about as close to a breath freshener as anyone in the Middle Ages was going to get. Small, crunchy, and oddly satisfying, they were a strange mix of treat, digestive aid, and dental hazard. Making them took real effort. Sugar wasn't cheap. It had to be imported, boiled down, and poured by hand. So if someone went through the trouble of candying fennel seeds, you knew they weren't messing around. Nobles served them after big meals, partly to settle the stomach, partly to mask the scent of whatever just came off the spit. The fennel itself had a bold, licorice-like bite. You either enjoyed it or swallowed hard and pretended. The sugar helped take the edge off, but the herbal punch still came through, making you feel a little fancy and slightly unsure about your life choices. People swore fennel helped with digestion, especially after a feast involving too many birds and too much meat. Think of these seeds as a mix between breath mints and antacids, with a healthy risk of chipping a tooth. You didn't just crunch into one, you gently tested it first. One bite, a little crackling, then maybe a second. Every seed was a gamble. For the rich, the seeds were sugar-coated perfection. For everyone else, homemade versions made dew, honey, some crushed herbs, and a dash of wishful thinking. Not the same, but enough to play along. They didn't fill you up, but candied fennel seeds left a clean taste in your mouth and gave off a faint sense of dignity, even if you were covered in mud and wearing a tunic stained with grease. And if any medieval dessert deserved the spotlight, it was the honey cake. Sticky, dense, and universally adored. But that's a whole story on its own. Sometimes, these medieval snacks curled into weird shapes that made you stop mid-bite and rethink your life. But honestly, by the standards of the time, they were pretty fancy, crispy, full of flavor, and relatively unlikely to give you dysentery. The only real issue? The smell. You could fry up a batch and the scent would drift down the road, alerting neighbors 3 huts over. Cook them indoors and your house would reek of Poseidon's laundry for a week. But people forgave the stench because they were just that good. Now, when the pantry offered little more than stale bread and lukewarm beer, you didn't complain. You got creative. Enter one of the most humble, hearty snacks of the time, bread soaked in ale. Known as soups or trench toast, this was comfort food stripped down to the basics. Think French toast, but skip the eggs, skip the cinnamon, skip the joy. The process was simple. Take yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as a brick, and dunk it in ale. Not modern ale with clever labels and citrus notes. This was flat, low-alcohol ale brewed in a smoky back room by someone who may or may not have washed their hands that week. The bread soaked it up like a suspicious sponge and softened into something chewable. Was it delicious? If the lighting was right and your expectations low, sure, kind of. It was warm and carried the faint bitterness of grain, which beat the taste of dry crusts and disappointment. It was especially popular with workers who didn't have time for meals that needed forks. Quick, filling, and just messy enough to feel like an actual break from labor. On better days, folks added toppings. Maybe a bit of cheese, a sprinkle of herbs, even a fried egg if the hen was feeling generous. For special occasions, you might get spiced ale with your bread, meaning someone dug up a pinch of nutmeg and decided to go wild. Like most medieval dishes, soups had a second purpose. Wasting food was not an option. Bread too stale? Soak it. Ale going sour? Pour it over bread and pretend it was intentional. The only real flaw, portability. Once soaked, the bread became a kind of boozy sponge cube. If you didn't eat it fast, you were left with a soggy mess and a metaphor for shattered expectations. Still, on a cold evening by the fire, a bowl of ale-soaked bread was exactly the kind of slow, sloppy meal that brought a weird sense of peace. And if you've ever dunked bread in wine and thought, this could be a whole thing, congratulations, you have something in common with the medieval upper class. Sops in wine were one of the era's more refined, and bizarrely specific, desserts. The idea was straightforward. Toast some bread, or at least find a slice that wasn't rock hard, and soak it in wine. But not just any wine. We're talking warm, mulled, spiced wine, often sweetened and aged just long enough to raise questions. Once the bread was fully drenched, it was served as a spoonable dish, and somehow called elegant. This wasn't the kind of food you casually nibbled. You ate it slowly, with a spoon, probably while listening to a lute performance and pretending you understood the conversation. Sops in wine showed up at banquets, late-night feasts, and awkward dinners where everyone avoided politics by passing around goblets of soggy toast. When done well, it was oddly satisfying. The wine added warmth and depth, the bread gave it some texture, and the spices made it feel just fancy enough. It didn't make much sense, but it didn't really need to. In a time where dessert often meant not turnips, this boozy bread pudding felt like a decadent way to end a meal. When sops and wine were made poorly, you knew it immediately. No amount of cinnamon could distract from the fact that you were chewing on a mistake. Wet bread in a bowl pretending to be a dish. People tried to jazz it up with dried fruits, nuts, cheese, and occasionally even dropped in a whole egg. At that point, it stopped being a snack and turned into a full-on culinary mystery. Peasants often made their own versions, usually substituting cheap ale or vinegar for wine. It wasn't dessert. It wasn't really breakfast either. It was just food, filling, confusing, and there when you needed it. Still, sops and wine stuck around. They were warm, rich in theory, and gave people a little taste of elegance, even if they kind of tasted like sponge soaked in spiced regret. Now let's talk dried fruit. In the Middle Ages, this stuff was treasured. It was sweet, exotic, and tough enough to survive everything from a monastery pantry to a crusade. But don't expect the kind of dried fruit you'd find in today's trail mix. Medieval dried fruit had one job, not spoil. Flavor was optional. Texture was a challenge. Raisins, figs, dates, and, if you were really living large, imported prunes made up the core lineup. These weren't gently dehydrated in a commercial facility. They were sun-dried, smoke-dried, or just abandoned on a windowsill until they gave up all moisture and turned into little edible fossils. But they were sweet, intensely sweet. Concentrated sugar made them taste like candy, and people went wild for them. Nobles served them at feasts. Monks stashed them away. Kids treated them like treasure. But eating them wasn't easy. Figs were full of tiny seeds that felt like medieval dental floss. Dates were so sticky they could glue your jaw shut. Raisins lodged themselves in your molars and stayed there, reminding you of their presence long after the meal. They showed up in pies, porridge, and honey cakes, basically any dish that needed a pinch of sweetness and a hint of luxury. If you had money, you might get dried fruit wrapped in pastry, drizzled with rosewater, or soaked in wine to impress someone important. For the average person, just getting some was a holiday-level event. And when you did, you ate them slowly, maybe even hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit didn't go bad quickly. It was kept in clay pots or cloth sacks and hardened over time, turning into something between a long-lasting treat and a very small weapon if thrown hard enough. Sweet, fancy, and a little dangerous, dried fruit was peak medieval snack. But let's say you weren't in the mood for sweetness. You wanted something heavy, something fried, something that bit back. Enter the blood pudding ball. This was no ordinary snack. It was rich, dense, and unapologetically packed with iron. Basically, if sausage rolls are polite small talk, blood pudding balls are a punch to the face. Born from the use everything approach to cooking, these bold little spheres were proof that nothing in the medieval kitchen went to waste, not even blood. Here's how they worked. You started with fresh animal blood, usually pig, though anything was fair game. Then came oats, onions, suet, that's beef fat, and whatever spices you could get your hands on. The mixture turned into a thick, dark porridge. Once it reached a level of grim stickiness that felt just right, you rolled it into balls and dropped them into hot fat to fry. What came out was dark, crispy on the outside, and protein-packed on the inside. These things had weight, literal and metaphorical. They were intense, filling, and weirdly comforting in a, this might be a health risk but I'm still eating it, kind of way. A hint of smoke and maybe a memory of whatever had last been cooked on the iron. These wafers weren't rich or showy, they were barely sweet, barely salty, and barely soft. But they were everywhere. You'd find them handed out by monks after services, sold at village markets, or stuffed into a pouch to nibble on during long walks across muddy fields. Some people crumbled them into soups. Others layered them like proto-lasagna with soft cheese or dried fruit if they were feeling luxurious. And yes, they did sometimes float in broth, looking suspiciously like a religious symbol that wandered into your lunch. Wafers were especially popular because they lasted. Thin and dry, they didn't spoil quickly, and they were easy to carry, stack, and store. And while they were technically dessert adjacent, no one was confusing them with cake. They were the edible equivalent of background music, always there, rarely the star, but strangely comforting. Back to blood pudding balls for a moment, because they deserve it. These were meals in miniature, dense with oats and onions and that telltale iron tang that clung to your tongue all day. Best enjoyed hot and straight from the skillet, they were still fair game cold, assuming you were hungry enough to overlook the jelly-like fat that formed around them. Nobles sometimes dressed them up with pepper, eggs, or a good ale. For peasants, the appeal was simpler. They weren't chewing on boiled cabbage again. They weren't fancy, but they were effective. Portable, caloric, and deeply filling. 2 of these things and you were set until dinner. 4, and you were either a blacksmith or trying to win a bad bet. Markets, fairs, roadside stalls, anywhere that smelled like livestock and effort, you'd find them. Especially during the colder seasons, when nothing warmed your soul quite like fried coagulation. Sure, they weren't for everyone. The texture threw some people off. The concept made others queasy. But when survival was the priority and flavor was an afterthought, blood pudding balls were heroes of the snack world, earning their spot in the unofficial medieval junk food hall of fame. Now about those pancakes. If you're picturing fluffy stacks dripping with syrup, stop right there. Medieval pancakes were their own beast. Flat, tough, fried in enough lard to make your doctor pass out, and just uneven enough to have character. They started simple: flour, eggs, and either water or ale. The batter went onto a searing hot iron griddle slick with pig fat. There were no perfect rounds or golden brown guarantees. You got what you got, often lopsided, maybe a little burnt on one side and undercooked on the other. It didn't matter. It was hot, filling, and fast. Some people added herbs or onions. Others sweetened things up with honey or a splash of ale for tang. Most just took what they got and devoured it like they were running from a taxman. Pancakes were one of the most democratic foods around. Everyone ate them. Nobles, peasants, monks, merchants. They could be savory, sweet, or just there. You could roll them up, layer them, soak them in broth, or pretend they were cake. Sometimes they even stood in for meat on fasting days, turning a religious restriction into a greasy loophole. No one called them beautiful, but they stuck around for centuries for a reason. Pancakes didn't need applause. Just a hot pan and someone with an empty stomach. And that's where wafers come in, somewhere between pancake and paper, snack and ceremony. Crisp, light, and suspiciously holy-looking, they rounded out the medieval snack menu not with flavor, but with quiet endurance. Whether floating in soup or passed out after Mass, they did their job, asked for nothing, and chipped more than a few teeth along the way. Wafers earned their place in medieval snack culture not because they were delicious, they weren't, but because they made sense. They were quick to cook, easy to sell, and light enough to carry by the stack. Vendors took full advantage, especially on church feast days. They'd line up outside the doors as the faithful filed out of Mass, waving warm wafers like edible flyers. No one actually said, "Buy now, sin later," but let's be honest, that was the general energy. They came pressed with patterns, crosses, saints' faces, floral designs, or just whatever the iron mold decided that day, depending on how tired the baker was. These flourishes didn't affect the taste, still mostly crispy air with a hint of heat, but they gave you something to look at while you chewed and pondered your life. Wafers were fragile to a fault. They cracked if you breathed too hard, shattered if you tried to break them cleanly, and turned into flaky chaos in the presence of wind. Eating one outside was an extreme sport. Still, people loved them. Light, crisp, and just fancy enough to feel like a treat, they were affordable little indulgences that didn't leave you clutching your stomach in regret. For the rich, wafers were dressed up with layers of cheese or sweetened fruits. For everyone else, they were bought by the dozen and eaten immediately before they dissolved into edible dust. Quick, crunchy, and spiritually adjacent, wafers were the medieval way to treat yourself without breaking the bank or your digestive system. Then there was sucket. Even the name sounds sticky, and it was. Sucket was fruit that had been boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in jars like sweet, glistening prisoners. Think slices of orange, ginger, or dates candied so aggressively they sparkled. One bite and your teeth winced. 2 bites and your soul did. This wasn't a peasant snack. If you were out in the fields chewing through your 7th onion of the week, sucket wasn't on the menu. It was a luxury item, dessert with a price tag. It showed up at weddings, royal feasts, and sometimes on random Wednesdays if you were wealthy, bored, and mildly unhinged. Making sucket was a full-time commitment. The fruit was boiled in syrup, sometimes honey, sometimes refined sugar if your spice merchant liked you. Then it was drained, dried a bit, and boiled again. And again. This wasn't about preserving fruit. It was about total domination. You were waging war against water content, and losing was not an option. The end result was candy. Glossy, jewel-toned, and chewy to the point of resistance. Some versions stayed soft in jars, swimming in syrup. Others were rolled in sugar and cut into dainty little cubes, the kind of treat that came with a napkin, a warning, and a faint sense of wealth-induced dizziness. Sucket wasn't just food, it was status. If someone passed you a tray of it, they were saying, "I have access to sugar, trade routes, and a servant whose only job is to stir things that burn easily." At banquets, sucket was handed around like treasure. Guests took one, smiled politely, and immediately wished they'd grabbed more. Meanwhile, the kitchen staff watched from a distance, hoping to sneak a lick off the spoon. Was it worth the hype? Honestly, yes. Sucket was one of the few medieval sweets that actually felt like dessert. Rich, decadent, and just absurd enough to distract you from the fact that dinner had been mostly boiled sadness. And then we arrive at the grand finale of medieval snackdom, fried eel. A dish so confusingly popular it slithered its way from muddy rivers to royal tables without ever stopping to question whether that was a good idea. Yes, Eel was absolutely everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers, streams, ponds, any decent body of water practically sloshed with them. They were easy to catch, cheap to cook, and surprisingly delicious once fried. Slippery when raw, packed with bones, and shaped like something out of a fish-themed horror story, eels still made it onto dinner tables by the bucketful. Because they were tasty. And more importantly, they weren't turnips. Catching them was usually done at night, when the eels slithered through shallow water like sentient noodles. Then came the challenge, skinning one. Less like cleaning a fish and more like wrestling a wet, angry rope. Once you'd won that battle, you'd chop them up, season if you had something on hand, and toss the pieces into hot fat. The skin would crisp. The meat would firm up. The end result? A savory, crispy bite that tasted like calamari and chicken had teamed up during a kitchen identity crisis. Fried eel wasn't just common, it was celebrated. Served at fairs, inns, feasts, and oddly enough, even during religious fasts. You see, eel wasn't technically meat by the church's definition, so it slipped right through the dietary loopholes. Monks devoured it. Nobles showed it off. Kings had it baked into elaborate pies and marched across banquet tables like the majestic sea serpent it always secretly dreamed of being. Sure, the bones were a nuisance. And yes, sometimes the eel twitched long after it was prepared, giving diners a brief moral crisis. But if you got past that, and the feeling that your food might curse your family, it was genuinely good. Crispy outside, tender inside, with just enough grease to feel slightly reckless. A perfect bite for a dangerously indulgent Wednesday. To modern eyes, it might seem absurd, but back then, eel was a beloved delicacy. Slippery, strange, and satisfying. It filled stomachs and kept things interesting. Meanwhile, in an entirely different world, ancient Mesopotamia, the idea of weird but important applied to dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, dreams weren't random nighttime entertainment. They were messages, divine telegrams, a cosmic inbox pinging with instructions from the gods. Ignoring a dream? That was like leaving a message from Enlil on read. Not wise. By 2500 BC, dream interpretation had become a full-blown science, or at least a well-organized art. These civilizations recorded dream meanings on clay tablets, written in cuneiform script. But they didn't treat them as bedtime trivia. Dreams were consulted in politics, medicine, and religion. A bad dream could delay a king's military campaign. A weird one might stop a farmer from planting his fields. Because the world, they believed, never stopped talking, you just had to pay attention with your eyes closed. They even had professionals for this. Dream experts called Baru priests worked kind of like therapists, but with way more supernatural authority. They studied massive collections of dream omens, manuals like the Ishkar Zakik, which cataloged dream symbols and their outcomes with alarming precision. Dream of eating dates? Good news is on the way. Dream of your teeth falling out? Brace yourself, death in the family. Have a dream about sex with a goddess? Either you're blessed or dangerously arrogant, and possibly both. These weren't guesses. They were equations. If you see X, then expect Y. See a snake? Betrayal's coming. Fall off a rooftop in your sleep? A lawsuit's in your future. The logic made sense. It just happened to be divine logic, which ran on rules humans only partially understood. And they didn't just interpret dreams, they tried to summon them. Rulers who needed guidance might sleep inside a temple under specific ritual conditions, hoping the gods would speak through their dreams. This practice, known as dream incubation, was like divine customer service. Place your request, take a nap, and hope the gods get back to you before breakfast. Then, once cleansed and prepared, would they lie down in the abaton, dark, quiet, and filled with the heavy scent of incense, and wait for a dream. The hope was that Asclepios himself, or one of his sacred animals like a snake or dog, would appear in their sleep to offer a diagnosis or healing touch. This wasn't metaphorical. Greeks believed the gods worked directly through dreams, and many patients awoke claiming to have been cured during the night. The temples kept records, stone inscriptions of successful dreams, healings, and miraculous visions. These weren't just testimonials. They served as divine receipts, proving the temple's spiritual credibility and encouraging more visitors. Sometimes the dreams came in the form of clear instructions: drink a special herbal mixture, perform a certain sacrifice, or go on a pilgrimage. Other times, they were cryptic, requiring interpretation by temple priests trained in sacred texts and dream lore. Greek dream interpretation wasn't separate from medicine, it was a part of it. Illness wasn't just a physical imbalance, but a sign of spiritual disharmony, something that could only be truly understood through divine insight. Dreams were the gods' language, and sleep was the appointment time. This belief in healing through dreaming made its way into many aspects of Greek life. People traveled long distances just to sleep in these temples. Some stayed for days or weeks, participating in prayers, rituals, and dream observation, waiting for that one night when the divine would speak. So across the ancient world, whether in the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the temples of Egypt, or the sanctuaries of Greece, dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages, treatments, and spiritual events. People didn't just sleep. They listened. And what they heard in their dreams could change everything. Dreams, seriously, especially the prophetic ones. While they were often grounded in law, warfare, and administration, the Romans still left room for omens, signs, and dreams that seemed to reach out from the divine. Emperors kept dream interpreters on staff, and some decisions, military campaigns, political moves, even marriages, were made based on what someone saw while asleep. Back in the healing temples of Asclepios, after all the purification rituals, bathing, fasting, incense offerings, maybe even a small sacrifice, the hopeful would finally be allowed to lie down in the abaton, the temple's quiet sleeping chamber. The bed wasn't soft. It was often just a stone slab, maybe covered with some kind of blanket if you were lucky. But comfort wasn't the goal. Clarity was. According to inscriptions and ancient testimonials, some patients dreamed of Asclepios himself touching them with his staff. Others saw snakes, his sacred animal, slithering gently across their bodies. Many woke up claiming to feel cured, or at least convinced they'd been given divine instructions. Drink this, do that, change your life. Whether these dreams were mystical, psychosomatic, or placebo-fueled doesn't really matter. The results were real enough to those who experienced them. Even Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, acknowledged the value of dreams. They didn't treat them as superstition. Instead, they believed dreams could reveal internal health through symbols. Flowing water? Possibly a kidney issue. Dreams of pressure or crushing could indicate chest problems. In Hippocratic medicine, dreams were categorized into two types: natural and divine. Natural dreams stemmed from digestion, diet, or emotional turmoil. Divine ones came from the gods and required special attention. And while temple priests handled the sacred, another group handled the interpretive spectacle, the oneirokraitai, or dream interpreters. These were the public experts, standing in the marketplace with dream books, a flair for drama, and a knack for turning night visions into divine insight. The most famous of them all was Artemidorus of Daldis, whose Oneirocritica, written in the 2nd century CE, became the go-to manual for decoding dreams across the ancient world. To the Greeks, dreams weren't just personal experiences. They were portals, bridges between the human and the divine, the body and the soul, illness and healing. Wake from the right dream, and you might rise cured, or at least with a divine snake curled beside your feet. And through all these cultures, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the temples of Egypt, the sanctuaries of Greece, and the courts of Rome, one category of dream always stood. Above the rest, the prophetic dream. These weren't just symbolic or diagnostic. They were revelations, messages that warned of danger, foretold glory, or laid out the steps of fate. The ancient Hebrews revered prophetic dreams as sacred channels. The Old Testament is full of them. Joseph, son of Jacob, dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing to a vision of his future rise to power. Later, he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, 7 fat cows, 7 lean ones, predicting a national crisis. His interpretation shaped Egypt's economy and survival. Joseph wasn't just a dream reader, he became a policymaker because of it. Mesopotamian kings also leaned heavily on dream messages. Assurbanipal, the powerful Assyrian ruler, claimed to see gods in his dreams, guiding him in battle and law. To receive such dreams was to be chosen. They served as divine confirmation that a ruler held cosmic favor, essential in an age where political legitimacy and spiritual authority were intertwined. The Greeks, too, separated dreams into categories. Those from the subconscious were enipnia, but the ones that revealed truth, the oniiroi alethinoi, were sacred. Leaders often consulted dreams before launching wars, founding cities, or setting out on journeys. Dream deities, like the oniiroi, were imagined as winged spirits entering the minds of sleepers, bearing godly messages. Even the pragmatic Romans acknowledged the prophetic dream. They might have built empires on discipline and strategy, but they still listened to their dreams, especially when the gods seemed to be whispering warnings in the dark. Serious enough to rival any ancient encyclopedia, packed with observations, case studies, and symbolic logic gathered from decades of listening, observing, and interpreting. Artemidorus of Daldis didn't just collect dream meanings, he built a framework. He traveled widely, interviewing people of all social classes, from philosophers to fishermen, collecting real-world examples of dreams and their outcomes. His goal? To understand not just what a dream meant, but why it meant that. The Oneira Critica, written in the 2nd century CE, became the definitive guide to dream interpretation in the ancient world. Its 5 books were organized with care: common symbols, recurring dream scenarios, bodily images, sexual dreams, which he treated in surprising detail, and case-specific examples. Unlike dream priests who relied on divine authority, Artemidorus leaned on pattern recognition, logic, and cultural nuance. If you dreamed of flying, he'd consider your social rank. Are you a slave? It could mean escape. A free man? Maybe ambition. A sick person? Death, perhaps, because in dreams, freedom and the afterlife weren't so different. He insisted that the dreamer's personal context mattered. Dreams weren't one-size-fits-all. The symbol of a snake didn't mean the same to a sailor as it did to a soldier. And while he respected divine dreams, Artemidorus emphasized that most dreams were reflections of waking life, inner thoughts, and unconscious fears. He saw dream interpretation not just as prophecy, but as psychology long before the term existed. This systematic, practical approach didn't stop his work from being deeply influential in both religious and secular life. Roman emperors, Christian mystics, medieval scholars, and even Renaissance thinkers would turn to his manual for guidance. Because even as spiritual beliefs shifted, the need to understand the strange images of sleep remained. By Artemidorus's time, dream interpretation had matured from temple ritual to intellectual discipline. But its power stayed the same. Across centuries and continents, from Mesopotamian omen tablets and Egyptian papyri to Greek sanctuaries and Anatolian hilltop shrines, dreams had always served the same function, as a whisper from the unknown. And in that whisper, empires listened, kings changed course, the sick found hope, and the ordinary looked for meaning in the mysterious theater of their own sleeping minds. Dreaming wasn't just what happened at night. It was a sacred dialogue, an ancient technology of understanding the self, the gods, and everything in between. Suggested that dreams could reveal the hidden parts of the soul, the chaotic, unruled impulses that society tried to suppress. In his view, nightmares weren't just supernatural threats. They were glimpses into the darker corners of the human psyche, stirred up when the rational mind loosened its grip in sleep. But while philosophers like Plato examined the psychological weight of dreams, everyday people across the ancient world treated nightmares as real and dangerous. If a dream left you sweating, shaking, or sick, it wasn't just dismissed, it was treated like a spiritual emergency. The Babylonians were some of the first to draw a hard line between divine messages and demonic attacks. Their dream interpreters knew the signs. Dreams that caused fear or illness were labeled polluted, and special rituals were performed to cleanse the dreamer. These might involve the burning of incense, the chanting of protective spells, or symbolic acts meant to reset the spirit, like sleeping in a different position, wearing a protective charm, or in serious cases, moving to a new dwelling. In Egypt, nightmares had their own arsenal of countermeasures. Protective amulets were common, especially the Eye of Horus, which symbolized healing and protection, and images of Bes, the dwarf god who guarded homes from evil. People wore these as jewelry, tucked them under pillows, or hung them over sleeping areas to keep the dark forces out. Nightmare spells were also part of everyday magic, spoken aloud upon waking, designed to erase the dream before it could bleed into waking life. The belief was clear. If the dream could enter the real world, it had to be stopped at the threshold. Greek culture added another layer. While divine dreams came from Olympian gods, nightmares were often blamed on chthonic deities, those linked to the underworld, justice, and vengeance. A dream involving the Erinyes, Furies, or the goddess Persephone might indicate unresolved guilt, crimes unpunished, or divine rage. These dreams weren't ignored, they were warnings from the underworld, and the price of brushing them off could be spiritual or social ruin. Dreams in the ancient world were taken seriously, but nightmares, those dark, vivid flashes of terror, held a unique place. They were seen not as illusions, but as interventions. They revealed hidden dangers, unspoken truths, and spiritual imbalances. To dream badly was to be marked, to be shown something that needed action, whether through ritual, repentance, or radical change. And into this world of belief, fear, and mystery stepped figures like Artemidorus, who tried to make sense of it all. His Oneirocritica, written in crisp, accessible Greek, catalogued thousands of dreams and their meanings, gathered from interviews, temple records, and public dream readings. He spoke with soldiers, sailors, merchants, prostitutes, anyone who dreamed, which meant everyone. What set Artemidorus apart was his attention to context. Other dream books handed out rigid definitions. A snake means betrayal, falling means death. But Artemidorus asked more. Who are you? Where are you in life? To him, a dream only made sense when it was interpreted in light of the dreamer's personal experience. A nobleman dreaming of being naked might fear public shame. A slave dreaming the same could be on the verge of freedom. It was dream interpretation made human, personalized, flexible, and intuitive. He didn't see dreams only as divine prophecy. He saw them as coded expressions of thought, worry, hope, and memory. His interpretations embraced symbolism, irony, metaphor. Death could mean rebirth. Sex could mean power or guilt. Everything had layers. The Oneirocritica wasn't just a curiosity. It shaped the way people understood dreams for centuries. It was used in the Roman Empire, in the Byzantine world, and later in the Islamic Golden Age through Arabic translations. Artemidorus gave dreams a language that crossed cultural lines. To him, they weren't just omens, they were windows into the soul. And so, whether divine whispers or haunted howls, the dreams of the ancient world were never just dismissed. They were listened to, recorded, studied, and feared. Because in sleep, when the body rested and the conscious mind drifted, something else woke up, and it often had something to say. Oneirocritica into Arabic, preserving and expanding Artemidorus' work. Medieval Christian monks copied and annotated dream manuals. Jewish mystics wove dream interpretation into Kabbalistic thought. And in all of these cases, the same idea persisted, that sleep was never just rest, it was revelation. In ancient thought, dreams had always been a battleground. Plato saw them as a clash between reason and appetite, where the lower self could run rampant if the rational mind wasn't strong enough to hold the line. Nightmares, in this view, weren't just warnings from the gods or spirits, they were red flags from your own psyche, signs of imbalance or unchecked desire. Even the ever-practical Romans weren't immune to this thinking. They feared dreams of certain animals, owls, snakes, wolves, not as superstition, but as omens of death, betrayal, or war. And they, too, believed that the dead could visit the living through dreams, not always as peaceful messengers but sometimes as accusers or prophets. To dream was to walk the edge of the seen and unseen, and every nightmare reminded them, you are never truly alone, even in sleep. But dreams weren't just private affairs. They were public tools, weapons of influence in the hands of rulers, priests, and prophets. Dreams could justify wars, crown kings, and silence dissent. If the gods appeared in a dream, the dreamer suddenly held divine authority. And if that dreamer was a leader, it became policy. Alexander the Great famously claimed to have dreamed of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. When he arrived at the Siwa oasis in Egypt, the oracle confirmed this dream, declaring Alexander divine. Whether this sequence was orchestrated or truly inspired didn't matter. The result was what counted. His troops believed it. His enemies feared it. His divine status was sealed. Augustus, too, used dreams to his advantage. He spoke of a dream foretelling his victory at Actium over Mark Antony and Cleopatra. After winning, the story was stamped onto coins and told in epic poems. History elevated into myth. Later emperors followed this blueprint, blending dream with doctrine. If the gods dreamed alongside you, who could say you were wrong? Priests and oracles played a crucial role in maintaining this balance of power. Their interpretations, often shaped to support existing hierarchies, became a kind of divine scriptwriting. A rebellious governor's troubling dream could be framed as a warning from the gods, a call to submission. A king's dream of plenty could become a license to raise taxes or launch a campaign. And this wasn't just a man's game. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, ruling in a time when pharaohs were expected to be male, claimed that the god Ammonius appeared to her mother in a dream, foretelling her divine right to rule. By casting her reign as heaven-ordained from conception, she bypassed political resistance with celestial approval. In the Hebrew Bible, dreams became tools of both revelation and resistance. Daniel didn't just interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue, he used it to declare the impermanence of empires and the rise of divine justice. In that moment, a dream was no longer personal. It became prophecy woven into politics. Across cultures, across centuries, dreams gave leaders a simple but powerful message. This isn't just my decision, it's the will of heaven. Whether those visions came in sleep or were shaped for influence didn't matter. Dreams were currency, spiritual capital that could be spent to control armies, calm rebellions, or claim divine favor. And though the temples are gone, and the dream priests have long since turned to dust, their influence remains. In our fascination with symbols, recurring dreams, and hidden meanings, we're still echoing the questions of the ancients. What does it mean? Why did I see this? What is my mind trying to tell me? Modern psychology has given us new language, subconscious, archetype, trauma, but the core pursuit remains the same, trying to understand why we dream, what dreams mean, and whether there is wisdom hidden in those flickering moments between waking and sleep. From clay tablets to scientific journals, from prophetic warnings to therapy sessions, the dream lives on as mystery, mirror, and map. Yet in April of 1860, that wild idea became reality. It was called the Pony Express, and for 18 whirlwind months, it defied geography, logic, and the odds to become one of the most iconic mail systems in American history. Young riders, often teenagers, rode at breakneck speed across vast stretches of wilderness, carrying small pouches of letters packed into specially designed saddlebags called mochilas. Each station along the route, spaced roughly 10 to 15 miles apart, had a fresh horse waiting. Riders would leap off one mount and onto another, barely slowing down. Every ounce mattered. Only the lightest gear, thinnest paper, and most essential letters were allowed. The conditions were brutal. Riders faced scorching deserts, blizzards, swollen rivers, and the constant threat of attack. And yet they pressed on, bound by an unspoken code of endurance and duty. The journey from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, nearly 2,000 miles, was reduced to just 10 days. It was a technological and human triumph, but a short-lived one. The Pony Express began just as the telegraph was about to shrink the country in a different way. By late 1861, with the completion of the transcontinental telegraph line, the need for high-speed horseback mail vanished almost overnight. The Pony Express folded, leaving behind debt, legend, and a legacy of grit that would be retold for generations. Still, for a brief moment, it stitched together a fractured nation with speed, courage, and sheer willpower. It wasn't just a mail service. It was a lifeline, proof that the impossible could be done if you rode hard enough and believed the message mattered. Just as the ancients used dreams to connect the human and divine, the Pony Express used open land, brave riders, and a mad vision to connect a sprawling, fragile nation. Both were acts of faith and communication. One whispered in sleep, the other shouted across plains. And both, in their own way, asked the same question: what message is so important that it must cross impossible distance to be heard? There would be blazing daytime heat, bone-cracking cold at night, and the constant risk of ambush from bandits or hostile terrain. But if it worked, the Pony Express would become the fastest communication line between the eastern cities and the far-flung outposts of the American West. The problem was obvious. America was growing faster than its infrastructure, and something had to close the gap. Out of this mix of urgency, wild ambition, and sheer frontier daring, the Pony Express thundered into history, one saddlebag at a time. But it didn't come from nowhere. The Pony Express was the brainchild of three determined businessmen from the Missouri-based freight firm Russell, Majors, and Waddell. William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell already had experience hauling freight and military supplies across the frontier. But in 1860, they set their sights on something far more radical: a high-speed, cross-country mail system that could deliver letters from Missouri to California in just 10 days. For Russell, the stakes were personal. His name had been dragged through financial scandals, and his reputation was in tatters. He saw the Pony Express as a chance to redeem himself, a patriotic gamble that could also restore his standing and, ideally, land him a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander Majors was the planner. Deeply religious and famously disciplined, he insisted that all employees, including the riders, swear oaths to abstain from drinking, gambling, and profanity. He brought military-level precision to the operation, designing a system of relay stations that would cover the nearly 2,000-mile route with ruthless efficiency. William B. Waddell was the quiet anchor, handling the legal and financial side of things. While Russell made speeches and Majors managed logistics, Waddell kept the company's books, and often its creditors, in order. Together, the three invested heavily, without any government funding. They bought over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and constructed roughly 190 relay stations across some of the most remote and unforgiving parts of the frontier. It was a colossal risk, financially reckless and logistically insane, but it was also pure, undiluted American grit. In April 1860, the first ride was launched. The race was on, not just against time, but against geography. Building the Pony Express route was like throwing a rope bridge across a canyon in a windstorm. Fragile, ambitious, and full of unknowns. The route stretched from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, cutting across plains, mountain passes, deserts, and icy rivers. Riders would change horses every 10 to 15 miles, the maximum distance a mount could run at full speed before exhaustion. Every 75 to 100 miles, they'd reach a home station, where they could rest, eat, and hand the mail off to the next rider. The unsung heroes of the system, though, were the horses. More than 400 in total, chosen not for beauty or pedigree, but for speed and endurance. In the flat, open east, lightweight thoroughbreds galloped across the prairie. In the rugged, brutal terrain of the west, stocky and tough Mustangs carried the mail through mountains and desert. These were not fancy parade horses. They were the Ferraris of the frontier, bred for survival and sprinting. The entire operation ran on tight margins, time, energy, money, and there was no room for failure. But for 18 extraordinary months, it worked. Against all odds, the Pony Express delivered. And though it was ultimately made obsolete by the telegraph, it left behind a legacy of bold vision, raw courage, and the belief that distance, even 2,000 miles of wilderness, could be conquered with speed, determination, and just enough wild hope. Ragtag band of fearless young men who risked everything to carry the nation's words across nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness. Most were in their teens, light, fast, and willing to take on a job that was equal parts heroism and insanity. They rode alone, often at night, through some of the harshest, loneliest terrain in North America. There was no backup, no safety net, just them, their horse, and the mail. These riders became legends in their own right. Names like Johnny Fry, Pony Bob, Haslam, and William Buffalo Bill Cody echoed through the dusty trails of the frontier. They were paid well for the time, about $100 a month, more than a Union soldier made, but they earned every cent. Some rode over 100 miles in a single shift. Others braved ambushes, broken trails, and bone-shattering weather with little more than a revolver and a prayer. The job demanded relentless speed. Riders were expected to swap horses in under 2 minutes. At each station, they'd jump off one lathered, exhausted mount and leap onto a fresh one, slinging the mochila, the specially designed, saddle-hugging mail pouch, across the next horse's saddle without ever undoing a strap. That mochila, with its 4 locked mail pouches, was the soul of the operation. Lose it, and you didn't just lose letters, you lost the whole point. And yet, somehow the system worked. Stations, some sturdy forts, others barely more than sod shacks, had to be stocked with food, water, grain, and supplies months in advance. Every station was manned, defended, and prepared for the worst. The weather was often brutal, freezing nights in the Sierra Nevada, scorching days across the Utah desert, and summer thunderstorms that turned Nebraska trails into muddy quicksand. Wild animals, swollen rivers, collapsing trails, and human threats, from outlaws to rising conflict with Native American tribes, were ever-present dangers. But the mail kept moving. The first run of the Pony Express, launched on April 3, 1860, from St. Joseph, Missouri, was a triumph. Johnny Fry, most historians agree he was the inaugural rider, took off with a 20-pound mochila full of letters, newspapers, and telegrams, galloping west as a crowd cheered and cannons fired. Simultaneously, another rider left Sacramento heading east. Between them lay nearly 2,000 miles of untamed land, and the hope of proving that communication could conquer distance. The trip was completed in 9 days and 23 hours, faster than anyone had believed possible. Even though only a few letters were delivered on that first run, the message was loud and clear. America could be connected. It was about more than mail. It was about proving that isolation wasn't destiny, that speed, daring, and grit could shrink a continent. The Pony Express didn't just carry letters. It carried belief. Though the operation would only last 18 months, eventually replaced by the transcontinental telegraph, it left a mark far larger than its brief lifespan. It became a symbol of American determination, frontier courage, and the relentless push to connect. Because at its core, the Pony Express wasn't about horses or riders or stations. It was about communication and the lengths people would go to make sure a message got through. Were caught in the middle of the conflict, sometimes ambushed during their route or finding their relay stations burned to the ground. Riders like Pony Bob, Haslam didn't just face arrows or bullets, they rode through them, ducking fire to keep the mail moving. During the height of the Paiute War, Haslam famously volunteered to carry a vital message over 380 miles in under 40 hours, riding through war zones and sustaining arrow wounds along the way. He didn't stop. These were not cushioned adventures. They were tests of nerve and endurance, undertaken by boys who could barely grow a beard. Their world was endless open land, violent storms, shifting rivers, hostile crossings, and absolute solitude. There were no headlights, no road signs, no guarantees, only the moonlight, the trail, and the rhythm of hooves pounding the earth. And still they came back. What makes the story of the Pony Express so remarkable isn't just the speed, or the distance, or the sheer audacity of the venture, it's that it worked. Despite the odds, despite the near-constant threat of disaster, the mail almost always arrived. Out of more than 34,000 letters carried during the service's 18-month existence, only one was ever lost. That kind of reliability, across deserts, through war zones, over mountains, and in weather that would shut down modern highways, was nothing short of a miracle stitched together by determination and grit. The riders were paid well, earning up to $150 a month, which at the time was more than many professionals. But it wasn't just the money that kept them riding. It was the pride, the thrill, and the belief that what they were doing mattered. They were part of something bigger than themselves, delivering messages that held families together, carried news between coasts, and kept the country from feeling like it was splitting apart. In a time when California still felt like a distant outpost and the Civil War loomed on the horizon, the Pony Express brought the continent closer together. Not just in miles, but in spirit. For 18 bold, chaotic, heroic months, the Pony Express raced through history. It bridged impossible distances and laid the groundwork for a nation learning to move faster, speak louder, and stay connected. And at the heart of it all were those young, wiry daredevils, no older than boys, but remembered as legends. They didn't just ride, they rewrote the meaning of what could be done with courage, speed, and one determined horse at a time. It was a silent race, hoofbeats against electricity, and everyone knew which one would eventually win. By October 24, 1861, just a year and a half after that first triumphant ride, the last link in the transcontinental telegraph was completed in Salt Lake City. With it, the East and West coasts could now exchange messages instantly. The Pony Express was officially obsolete. 2 days later, it was shut down. It hadn't been profitable, far from it. Russell, Majors, and Waddell poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture and never saw a return. The hoped-for government mail contract never came. What they built was fast, brave, and brilliantly engineered, but it was always meant to be a stopgap, a bridge between old and new. And bridges, once crossed, are often left behind. But the Pony Express was never really about money. It was about momentum, about proving that connection across impossible distances was possible, even before wires, engines, or railroads. It was a furious, fleeting miracle stitched together with horses, grit, and a whole lot of teenage courage. Despite its short life, its influence echoed far beyond those 18 months. The stations it built became stepping stones for the telegraph, railroads, and postal routes. Its riders became folk heroes. Its path became a legend. And its legacy? It was about more than mail. It was about speed, unity, ambition, and a restless refusal to accept that distance meant disconnection. It was a testament to what could be done with sheer willpower and a horse galloping full speed into the unknown. In a land that stretched endlessly in all directions, the Pony Express proved that even the most distant corner of America could be reached, and that even the wildest frontiers could be crossed, one rider, one saddlebag, one message at a time. Though it lasted only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the nation's history. In reality, it was a risky, short-lived business venture held together by teenage riders, exhausted horses, and a lot of hope. But in the public imagination, it became something far greater, a symbol of heroism, speed, and the relentless spirit of the frontier. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks did the rest. The image of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a six-shooter at his side, captured the nation's heart. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still figuring out who it was, the Pony Express offered a story of bravery, sacrifice, and unity through hardship. It was a legend ready-made for a country built on ambition. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, whether or not he actually rode for the Express, saw the potential in the story and ran with it, literally and theatrically. In his traveling Wild West shows, he recreated the daring rides, the hostile terrain, and the narrow escapes, selling the Pony Express not just as history, but as epic. His performances reached millions across America and Europe, turning gritty reality into heroic myth, and fixing the image of the fearless teenage courier into the cultural bloodstream. The Express became shorthand for grit, daring, and everything Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now stand in cities and crossroads across the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths trace the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historical tours keep the memory alive, not because it was the most efficient system, but because it was the most audacious. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps, a tribute to a mail system that was never financially viable but spiritually priceless. It didn't just deliver messages, it delivered meaning. It proved that connection was possible even in the face of chaos. That speed could triumph over distance, even if just for a little while. But the story endures for a deeper reason. The Pony Express reminds us that sometimes a nation needs more than practicality. It needs symbols. Source: people willing to do something reckless and brave just to prove it can be done. It reminds us that technology doesn't erase heroism, it merely changes its tools. And that even in an age of wire, code, and instant connection, the heart still races a little at the thought of a lone rider hurtling across the prairie, dust in his eyes and destiny in his saddleback. He may have only galloped for 18 months, but the echo of his hoofbeats has lasted for centuries. Because the Pony Express didn't just carry mail. It carried the myth of America. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just common, it was cosmic. It served as nourishment, medicine, sacrifice, and celebration. Brewed from emmer wheat or barley, Egyptian beer was cloudy, thick, and often flavored with dates or herbs. It had a gritty texture and was often consumed with a spoon as much as sipped. And yet it was everywhere. From the grandest feasts to the humblest breakfasts, beer was the liquid foundation of life along the Nile. Children drank it. Workers drank it. Pharaohs drank it. Even the dead drank it, at least symbolically. Tombs were stocked with jars of beer for the afterlife, ensuring the deceased would not go thirsty in eternity. In festivals and temple rituals, beer was poured out as libations to the gods, while the living drank to mirror divine joy. It was both holy and habitual. And it wasn't just for pleasure. Beer was also payment. Laborers building pyramids and temples were often compensated in beer, up to 4 liters a day, turning the phrase, "drink for your work," into a literal policy. It kept workers hydrated, energized, and maybe just intoxicated enough to overlook the brutal hours and desert heat. Egyptian breweries were technological marvels of their time. Large vats, fermentation rooms, and recipe records show a level of sophistication that suggests beer production was both science and ceremony. Women often ran these breweries, particularly in domestic settings, making beer one of the few major industries in which female labor was central from top to bottom. The social status of beer was paradoxical. It was both a drink of the masses and a symbol of divine favor. Myths told of beer used to soothe Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of wrath, whose rage nearly destroyed humanity. The gods tricked her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood. She passed out, and the world was saved. That story alone tells you everything about how Egyptians saw beer. Powerful, dangerous, redemptive. In ancient medical papyri, beer was mixed with herbs to treat various ailments, anything from indigestion to depression. Doctors prescribed it, priests consecrated it, and commoners brewed it in clay pots under the blazing sun. Wherever you went in Egypt, beer was never far behind. In the end, Egyptian beer wasn't just a drink, it was a cultural constant. It tied together the fields, the kitchens, the temples, and the tombs. It was both ordinary and extraordinary, substance so central to life that to be without it was to be unmoored from society itself. And as their civilization flourished for millennia, beer flowed steadily through its veins, a golden thread in the fabric of an ancient world that never stopped toasting the gods with every cup. Remained the drink of the people, deeply tied to the earth, to labor, and to sacred cycles of life and death. Among the Hittites, beer was offered to gods in temple rites and consumed during feasts that marked everything from royal births to successful harvests. Though their brewing techniques resembled those of their Mesopotamian and Egyptian predecessors, the Hittites elevated beer as a diplomatic and spiritual tool, sharing it with envoys and using it in oath-making ceremonies. Among the early Hebrews, beer, known as shakar, was referenced in religious texts, sometimes with ambivalence. The Torah acknowledged its role in daily life but warned against overindulgence, distinguishing between sacred use and moral excess. Yet even in moderation, beer was woven into the agricultural and festival calendar, a marker of celebration and sustenance that transcended mere appetite. In all these cultures, beer carried a paradoxical identity, humble yet holy, common yet consecrated. It was the drink of farmers and gods alike, brewed in both clay jars and temple courts. fermentation, mysterious and unpredictable, seemed to embody the divine itself, a transformation of grain and water into something nourishing, intoxicating, and alive. What set beer apart from wine in the ancient world wasn't just ingredients or class, it was intimacy. Wine, often imported, processed, and associated with wealth and formality, was a guest at elite tables. Beer was homegrown. It was born from local grain, stirred by familiar hands, and consumed not in crystal goblets but through straws from communal pots. It fed workers, gladdened priests, and comforted the dead. Even as wine began to dominate elite circles in Greece and Rome, beer endured in kitchens, farms, and temples. And while it may not have inspired the symposia of philosophers or the poetry of Dionysian cults, it powered the great undertakings of ancient civilization, pyramids, temples, ziggurats, and cities, quietly, one jar at a time. So when we speak of beer in the ancient world, we don't just speak of a drink. We speak of a force, nutritional, economic, religious, that shaped the very roots of human society. In every sip was a prayer, a payment, a pause in toil. And in every brew, a silent tribute to the gods who, in legend and in life, turned grain and water into civilization's first toast. Sweeteners like dates or honey. These vessels, often sun-warmed and left to ferment naturally, produced beer that was thick, slightly sweet, and rich in nutrients, perfect for sustaining a household. Women who mastered the art of brewing were not merely cooks, they were alchemists of daily life, transforming raw grain into a drink that nourished the body and, in many beliefs, honored the gods. In temple breweries, female priestesses were often in charge of sacred brewing operations, preparing ceremonial beers for offerings and festivals. Brewing was seen as both a practical and a devotional act, and women stood at the intersection of both roles. Their work was recorded in tomb paintings, inscribed in administrative texts, and immortalized in hymns to deities like Hathor and Ninkasi. In these cultures, the brewer was more than a laborer, she was a vessel of cultural memory, a steward of life's rhythms. Even as patriarchal systems expanded and men began to dominate public religious and economic life, the legacy of female brewers lingered. In some parts of the ancient Near East, laws protected a woman's right to brew and sell beer. Widows, in particular, often ran taverns, and while the social perception of female tavern keepers could vary, from sacred to scandalous, the economic role was undeniable. These women were business owners, community anchors, and keepers of an ancient craft. Over time, as brewing became commercialized and increasingly associated with trade and taxation, men took over the formal roles, and the feminine origins of beer culture were gradually erased from official histories. But for thousands of years, beer was women's work, intimate, spiritual, essential. And even in this shift, the spirit of the early brewsters endured. Every pitcher of beer carried their legacy. Every tavern echoed with the practices born in clay jars and fire-warmed homes. What began as a domestic art helped give rise to cities, economies, and cultures. And behind the froth and foam, behind the sacred rituals and temple offerings, stood generations of women who brewed not for profit, but for family, for community, and for the gods. So when we lift a glass of beer today, we are not just drinking a beverage. We are sipping a story older than written language, a story of agriculture and spirituality, of women's knowledge and divine transformation. Beer was not just a cornerstone of civilization. It was its quiet, bubbling heartbeat, kept alive in the hands of women, generation after generation, one sacred brew at a time. Was a sophisticated, sensory art, one that demanded timing, skill, and an intuitive grasp of nature's invisible chemistry. Brewers knew how long to germinate grains, when to mix in sweeteners, how to judge fermentation by smell and bubble, and which vessels produced the cleanest or strongest brews. It was not just a task, it was a dialogue with the environment, with divine forces, and with tradition itself. And because each culture had its own unique geography and tastes, local styles began to emerge. In Sumer, beer was often darker and grainier, reflecting the hard, husky barley grown along the Tigris and Euphrates. In Egypt, beer could be sweeter and fruitier, thanks to the addition of dates and a slightly different grain profile. In the Levant and Anatolia, brewing likely incorporated regional herbs and spices, giving rise to early flavored alesh that hinted at what would much later become styles like mead or grutbier. Beyond ingredients, brewing was also about preservation and storage. In a world without refrigeration, fermentation was a miracle. It made water safe, created a product that could last longer than fresh food, and offered both refreshment and sustenance in one vessel. Jars were often sealed with cloth or wax, labeled by owners or priests, and stored in cool, shaded spaces. Some of these jars survive today, bearing residue that tells modern archaeologists exactly what was brewed and how. Evidence from dig sites confirms that beer was produced in a wide range of settings, from humble kitchens and village hearths to massive temple breweries capable of serving thousands. At sites like Tel Batsi in Syria, evidence of industrial-scale beer production has been uncovered, including large brewing vats and residues rich in fermentation byproducts. These were not one-off experiments. They were fully operational, community-supported enterprises, integrated into daily life and spiritual routine.